Hello. Hello. Thank you, everyone, that you came in the 15th seminar of Politics of Liberation. Today, we're very happy that we have with us Eugenia Siapera. She will give a talk on new technologies between liberation and subjugation. It's the title of her talk. And yes, the floor is yours. Yeah.
Thank you, George and Rosa, for inviting me, and thank you for the succinct introduction, George. So I'm pretty sure you'll all be very happy to hear that I'm not going to propose another new theory of capitalism, but what I plan to do for today is to kind of summarize where we stand, take stock, contextualize new developments in technology, and hopefully identify avenues that I feel offer opportunity for a resocialization of technology for the purposes of liberation. So this is what how I've planned this talk. I will begin with a contextualization of current developments within a broader frame of the last, I suppose, around 50 years or so, and then identify three critiques that I don't see as antithetical, but rather as building on one another, and then the three openings and possibilities, and then conclude with what next. So this is not necessarily an academic presentation, it's in between an academic discussion and an activist discussion, because I think it's quite important to highlight both possibilities and link academic production of knowledge to political and social action in real life. So where are we today? It's not good, and I'm not going to lie, it's really bad. So what we see is a lot of fluctuation in terms of GDP and other economic indicators. We see a global decline of manufacturing from the 1970s onwards, and I'm sure this is not news to anyone, but it's just sometimes we focus on new technologies and we forget the context of where new technologies developed and in what context they developed and the reason why they developed in the first place. But we also find ourselves in a very particular set of economic circumstances that people have referred to as stagflation, a combination of economic stagnation or very low growth along with inflation. Typically, stagflation is associated with high unemployment. We don't have this paradoxically, except for Greece. Greece is always an exception here. But generally, unemployment is still quite okay, around like 6%, I think, in Europe at least. But we're getting there because we've seen a lot of rounds of layoffs recently. So it's in this context that we encounter the key tech narrative, which I identify as summarize as the idea that disruptive innovations such as the internet or the personal computer or the smartphone or artificial intelligence will introduce important economic and social shifts, that these are going to be towards the area of, towards the direction of progress, economic growth, increases in productivity, job creation, and general advancement of humanity. So this is the dominant tech narrative. And this is associated with a key sector, economic sector, that developed as an autonomous sector altogether, the technology sector. So before the technology sector as such, technologies were in the service of other sectors, particularly manufacturing, and perhaps also agriculture and other sectors. But now we're talking about the evolution of a separate economic sector. And this is a growing sector, but it's very interesting to see that it's still marginal compared to other sectors in global economy. So compared to the hype and the kind of like discussions that the tech sector has generated, it still is. Its value is 5 trillion compared to a global GDP of 95 trillion. So it's very marginal still. And very interesting here to note is that 35% of this sector belongs to the United States. So the geopolitical, let's say, distribution of the tech sector is very specific. Interestingly enough, we see Asia as number 2 here, and this is driven primarily by China. And I don't know, like, I'm going to open a very brief parenthesis here. I don't know if you followed the news recently that America is going to impose sanctions on semiconductors for China so as to hinder its technological development. At the moment, China has more AI patents, I never get my pronunciation right here, than America. So, of course, America and the West are very concerned because they don't want to lag behind China. So what do? They decide to kind of like sabotage it by not giving it access to the types of semiconductors that it needs. However, this is creating problems for European industry because one of the flagship companies in the European Union, ASML, is selling conductors to China. So they're saying, well, what are you doing? Are you undermining our business? So we'll see what happens here, what's going to happen. But it's very interesting now to note that despite the hype, despite the narrative that technology is going to revolutionize everything, despite all the talks about Meta, Microsoft, Amazon, Apple, it's still a very tiny bit, a part of the global economy. What is at stake, however, is really, really important. And I quote here from Klaus Schwab, the favorite of all conspiracy theorists everywhere, the fourth industrial revolution. So this is the kind of like, if I were inclined towards the conspiracy type of thinking, I was going to say they're planning. So what is in the pipeline, what is potentially going to happen is a fourth industrial revolution. So the third industrial revolution was the shift to informalization, digitalization, whereas the fourth kind of like intensifies this. It involves increased automation, human-computer interaction, datafication, biocomputer fusion. If you Google transhumanism, and I don't necessarily advise you to Google transhumanism because it's one of the key narratives at the moment within like the conspiracy, conspiratorial subculture. But they do have some points because these are areas for concern in terms of who drives these and what say do people have in terms of the future direction of the economy and the future direction of society. And this is what is at stake. So regardless of how marginal the tech sector is in the economy right now, it's still a very important area that we need to kind of be involved in its evolution and its direction and its development. So this is what is at stake here, I think. So coming now to the critiques, the first kind of critique, I suppose we can kind of summarize it as the classic Marxist approach to technologies and how they have been used. And typically we see three areas of Marxist theory that are applied to technology: the labor theory of value, the labor process theory, and the organic composition of capital. And I don't want to go into too much detail here, but just to say that overall within Marxist theory, and from a historical materialist perspective, I suppose, if you look at struggles between capital and labor, and the way in which technology has been involved in this, it has always been, not always, but mostly been in the side of the capital. And this is because of this labor theory of value, that technologies affect the value of labor because they save time, so they affect the value of labor. The labor process theory involves the subsumption and control of labor by management through technology. And again, here we see that technologies work for capital, for the bosses, rather than for workers themselves. And we see also that the organic composition of capital, defined as the ratio of capital to labor, is also affected by technology because on some occasions it removes human labor altogether. And the graph here is apparently from Goldman Sachs. It's the jobs that are going to be affected by a new technology, which is ChatGPT. It's not that they're going to be removed, it's that they're going to be restructured. That's the estimate. This is a recent graph. That is the estimate of how many jobs are going to be affected by this particular technology. So from this point of view, from this critique, technology in the tech sector and its involvement is basically capitalism as we know it. It doesn't introduce anything particularly new. It follows the logic of capitalism to its kind of like natural conclusion. It intensifies labor and resource exploitation because it is driven by capital. And in particular, from the point of view of what drives technology, it's not human ingenuity, nor is it driven by social needs, but by the quest for profit that capital is driving. So we have the falling rate of profit, which is an important driver of new technologies, as more and more companies go for the same kind of market, the rate of profit falls, so therefore they're compelled to produce more technologies because that's what they are associated with. We're in a context of chronic economic underperformance. A lot of what we have seen in terms of economic growth has been because of financialization, because of the stock market and derivatives. And I have something to say about this in a minute. But it's not real production, it's not manufacturing, it's not stuff. It's fantasy that is kind of generating. So tech is kind of like associated with this tech innovation in particular. And of course, the capitalist constant quest for expansion, restructuring, growth. This is what kind of drives technological development. And of course, we have to articulate technological developments with a particular mode of governance within capitalism, which is the neoliberal mode of governance, and that does not pose any kind of barriers or any kind of limits or regulation to technological expansion. So from this point of view and from this, the point of view of this critique, technology cannot be in the service of emancipatory goals because it is driven by capitalism and it is invented for these kinds of purposes and because of these purposes. A large part of this critique is focusing on labor in particular. I'm also, parenthetically, just to say, in terms of this presentation, I always enjoy giving Microsoft's AI the opportunity to tell us what it thinks about my contents. So this is what it automatically generates. It's the design function of PowerPoint. So keep that in mind when you see the pictures. Not all of them, but some of them. So here it's very interesting to note that there was a point in time around the year 2000 that there was a lot of discussion about affective labor, cognitive labor, immaterial labor, and how these were going to afford more control, to give more control to workers over their own labor, that they could somehow address the question of alienation because people were invested more in what they were producing. However, conditions objectively worsened for workers. We see already 4 trends apparent in the 1990s, and I'm sure you all recognize them immediately through your own kind of like position in life. So working time is no longer the traditional pattern of 40-hour weeks. People work here and there, flexi work, remote work. Job stability is no longer the case for anyone, or for very few people at least. Remote work is not only possible, but it's happening almost every day. And the social contract between employer and employee is replaced by flexible arrangements. This comes from the work of Manuel Castells in the 1990s. So already these trends were apparent then. So by the year 2000, Castells was already identifying a fundamental restructuring of the capital-labor relationship that he says was driven by economic and technological opportunities and economic imperatives. An economic imperative was to address the question of profitability without the loss of profitability because of manufacturing and other kinds of like industry issues, without inflation. And the two paths that he identifies that historically occurred was one path was the France and Germany, that they sought to increase productivity without employment gains, so they kept like unemployment going, or the opposite, not the opposite, but a different path that was followed by the US and the Netherlands, increasing jobs but with lower costs, so the cost of labor, the wages fell. And I really, really like this quote because it's from almost 25 years ago, and it's still very, very current. That never was labor more central to the process of value making, but never were the workers more vulnerable to the organization, since they have become lean individuals farmed out in a flexible network whose whereabouts were unknown to the network itself. So I don't think we have moved very far from this quote. Some of you may not have even been born then. The second kind of critique focuses more centrally to the question of like an epochal shift that occurred around the year 2000 or 2011, some places. And the focus here is again on the tech sector as a specific economic sector in society, and in particular the rise of platforms as a paradigm of economic and social organization. So the question here is, are we witnessing a new capitalist formation? And I base this part of the discussion on the book written by Nick Cernisek called Platform Capitalism. So he traced the kind of history of the tech sector from the dot-com, the boom and the bust period. So this is what he kind of identified. So there was, in the 1990s, as I mentioned earlier, there was a downturn in manufacturing that led the quest for profitability in the emerging tech sector, and the way in which the dot-com boom area happened was because the money was cheap to borrow, basically, and venture capitalists had a lot of money and they wanted to invest it. They didn't want to invest it in manufacturing because the rate of the return to their investment was low. So they said, okay, what do? We invested in the tech sector. And they started investing like crazy, even if none of these companies made any actual profit. No profit, just fantasy that they're going to make profit. No business plan, no one had any business plan. So this is the kind of investment here. A stock valuation of these companies was completely disconnected from the real economy, and the tech stock rose 300% in these years, resulting in a capitalization of 5 trillion. Capitalization of 5 trillion with no revenue, effectively, so it was insane. Mostly the revenue of the dot-com era was from peripherals, from selling basically the hardware. So by 1990, 39% of all venture capital was going to tech companies. And then, of course, it crashed. It peaked on March 10, 2000, 5,000, the NASDAQ indicator. And then it fell down to almost 77% of its value by the year 2002. And then, of course, it then grew back up, but it took 15 years to return to the previous level. But yesterday that I looked at it, it was at 12,000, the indicator, and it was apparently because Meta and Google basically said that they had better results than expected. So it is in this kind of like context that that Cernisek makes the argument that that we see a new kind of like shift within capitalism that he describes as platform capitalism. He says that basically the dot-com crisis was followed by the crisis of 2008, and what capitalism does when it is confronted by crisis is to restructure. And then technologies presented this opportunity for restructuring by introducing new modes of exploitation, new types of jobs, new markets, new ways of capital accumulation. So for him, the key question is, can we describe these changes in tech and digital economy as a new model of capitalism? He says probably yes, because of the role that data play in this type of capitalism. So data now performs key functions for capitalism. Data sets are used to train and improve algorithms, to coordinate outsourced workers, optimize the production process, and of course, data analysis and analytics generate more data. So previous types of businesses could not integrate data in their structures, but platforms now afford this opportunity to collect data, and then as soon as you collect data, then you can start thinking what to do with it. So platforms operate as an extractive apparatus for data, and data then are made meaningful or valuable through techniques such as machine learning, and other kinds of techniques for data processing. Of course, labor is a big part for platform capitalism, and two types of changes are associated, or two types of issues associated with labor within platform capitalism. The first is the proletarianization of tech labor, fragmentation of tasks associated with the production of technologies. This idea of Kanban production mode, I don't know if you're familiar with this, it comes from Toyota manufacturing. Agile management is another kind of continuous iteration of software development. So you're never to a point where you say, that's it, we're finished with this. It's continuous feedback loops and constant production. And then, of course, gig work that has been made possible because of platforms that introduces a new level of exploitation. And I have a graph here that I got from Digital Future Society that shows the the pyramid. And the idea here is that, of course, the people in the bottom of the pyramid are the proletarians, and then as you move further up, they're more skilled and the elite and the aristocracy of tech labor. But in fact, what we see is that even this elite is proletarianized right now, and even these people are that we thought a couple of years or maybe 5 years ago that they're going to be the new tech aristocracy, they're laid off and proletarianized. This is something that I produced to just understand how the process of producing AI happens in real life. So I may be wrong, I may have omitted several things here, but these are some of the questions that arise here in terms of this idea of the labor that feeds into the production of artificial intelligence. So it's not like some nerd in some fancy headquarters in Silicon Valley, but there are a lot of people in the global south that are involved in data labeling, a lot of bureaucratic layer of managers that decide who is going to do what and distribute the labor, a lot of more hands-on management in terms of this agile management principles and so forth. I think that in addition to these issues that concern data extraction as the key business model of platforms and the question of labor, an area that has received relatively little attention for platforms is the issue of financialization. So platforms are very reliant on surplus capital that is gained from stock valuations. Exactly what happened in the dot-com boom era and bust era significantly is happening right now. Capitalization of the tech sector is still higher than the profit it generates. So it's the same. Things have not fundamentally changed. And of course they haven't changed because there's no regulation to regulate this. So if there's no regulation, the same thing is going to happen. I don't know if you saw this, but as soon as Alphabet, the company that owns Google, announced better profits than expected, they also announced a buyback of 70 billion. So these are the same people that are laying off almost 6% of their workforce at the same time as using 70 billion to buy back their own stock. So there is a metric that I found out very recently that exists. Probably some of you might know this already, but I didn't. So the stock valuation of a tech company depends on the amount of people that it has in its employment. So there is a ratio of profit to number of people that you employ. And then this determines the value of your stock. So the less people you employ with more profit, the less valuable your stock is. And this is what drives a lot of these companies to outsource even basic functions. And of course, to kind of like lay off massive amounts of labor that then they hire through outsourcing, but they preserve their stock value. So it's very important to note here that the tech sector operates as financialized capitalism at the same time as being like a tech sector. So this drives a lot of the developments in this area. You see the layoffs here, but also very important to note here is that we're talking about corporations with capitalization, like market value, that is very high. I don't have the numbers here, so I can't be sure how high it is, but it's quite high. But these are multinational corporations. But still, 6% of Google's workforce is 12,000. So they don't really employ that many people. This is why the layoffs haven't really affected unemployment rates across, at least across the West. Okay, so that is the conclusion that I get from this type of discussion here, that I want to kind of like put forward that, that tech corporations are first and foremost financialized actors. And despite the emphasis on new data capabilities, platforms really, I don't think that they have introduced any fundamental shifts in capitalism. So capitalism still operates with this kind of like, as financialized capitalism, which is the kind of post-industrial setup. However, there is this third kind of critique that kind of digs deeper into this area of datafication, that focuses on the effects that datafication has on different parts of social and political life. So here, the datafication is a new process to quantify parts of social life, parts of biological functions, and every aspect, basically, of the life world is a new process, and it has significant social effects. So this third critique that I'm referring to here, datafication, really does kind of like highlight this this area. And of course, for capitalism, data to control labor is very important, but also data to control or to quantify or to measure human activity. This is a new factor, a new an introduction of a new area that Kuldry and Mehi has referred to as data colonialism.
An example for this? For the dedication?
I will come to these examples in a minute. I will want to delve deeper. But like, for example, all your activity in social media is quantified and measured in terms of clicks, in terms of likes, in terms of shares. So these would be data points that are measured. So from your likes and your behavior across the internet, some corporations derive psychological characteristics, personality traits, and so forth. So in terms of how data is used to control labor, there is intense kind of data collection for workers in terms of personality tests, performance data, ratings. Every gig worker has like a reputation that they have to manage in terms of the ratings they receive that is central to how they operate. There is electronic monitoring, recording, video screen recordings, audio, keystrokes, intense and very, very close surveillance of workers that that intensified during the period of the pandemic. We also have algorithmic management of workers in call centers. So I saw somewhere someone saying, like, it's not that robots are going to take your job, it's that robots are going to be your manager, are going to tell you what to do. So I don't know which one is, I think it's worse, basically, to have a robot telling you what to do. These are actual examples from these companies. Cogito is the top one, and Coal Miner is the one below. So you're in a call center, you're speaking to someone, and you get all these cues, like, you're not showing enough empathy. Say this to show more empathy. Of course, the funny thing here is that humans are very ingenious, and they game these systems as much as possible. They sabotage them, they undermine them as much as they can, but still they are there. And then on the basis of this data collected concerning every aspect of human labor, then corporations make decisions, but also produce more data to sell and exploit in different ways. So it's a kind of like a self-fulfilling thing there. In terms of the life world, this is the example here that I referred to earlier. We have quantification, measurement, manipulation of social and biological life through datafying and tracking of people's activities. If you're like me and you like your wearables, I track every little bit of my heart rate, of my exercise, of the calories I spend. Of course, I use it for myself, but Google uses it for God knows what. I don't know, they don't tell me. So this is the biological kind of like element, but there is this element of what we do in social media or shopping, online shopping, banking, all of this is tracked and quantified. But of course, for this to happen, you have to create a whole new apparatus for data collection, storage, processing, and valorization, and a revenue model that relies on value generation based on extraction and processing. So this kind of like indirectly supports this idea that platforms do introduce new elements to capitalism, or new markets for capitalism, more like it. So this is what has led Couldry and Mejias to refer to this as data colonialism, that capitalism currently depends on this type of appropriation of human life through quantifying it. And they say, well, historical colonialism occupied territories, data colonialism occupies human life, and also that data is there to be captured, a kind of like a new terra nullius that parallels what happened in the colonialist era of expansion. Data colonialism, argue Couldry and Mejias, reflects a new phase of capitalism in which all human activity is annexed to capital, and this is why they think that this is the novelty here. So just as historical colonialism could not have happened without territorial appropriation, data colonialism and surveillance or platform capitalism would not have taken place were it not for the colonial appropriation of life and its annexation to capital through digital platforms. This is Couldry and Mejias' theory. Others, however, say, well, it's not really a new formation, but new technology reproduces and accentuates existing global power dynamics within a profoundly unequal global system. This is the work of Mirka Madianu, who says that, who found through her own research that people in refugee camps or in unsafe border crossings become populations for new biometric test beds for new biometric, their bodies, the new test beds for new biometric tech. Interestingly enough, Greece is one of the countries where this happens in the border, and the bodies of these people from unsafe countries are experimented on. So the appropriation and exploitation of people's lives through technology with promises to rationalize, improve, optimize, move towards progress, provide certainty. This is the machinery of techno-colonialism. This is a term that I take from Duran Matute and Camarina Gonzalez. who refer to this kind of like aspirational progressive rhetoric of connection, empowerment, which is entirely at odds with the reality on the ground, especially for people in the global south or for people who have been proletarianized because of new technologies. And here I want to refer to our work with Harris. We look at Greece 2.0 as an example of this kind of like techno-colonialist rhetoric, and this, especially this kind of rhetoric of progress, optimization, efficiency, smartness, sufficiency also, which is quite funny. It's all in this program that Amazon has made an agreement with the Greek government to implement in Naxos. You see here my attempt at a meme, Amazon in Naxos in the style of Ariadne in Naxos. And I have here a quote is in Greek, but and thanks to Harris for pointing this out to me, by Tanuja Randeri, who is some kind of boss in Amazon, who gave an interview to a Greek medium, and she said, we're not only looking to transform the island, we're looking to transform people and people's mentality. So this is an island that like 50 years ago, maybe 60 years ago, was completely self-sufficient, but now Amazon is going to come and make it sufficient. It's going to provide solutions, but we don't know what the problems are. But of course create also a new level of dependence, because if you replace your doctor with drones that automatically kind of like transport medicine from Athens to Naxos, then you're entirely reliant on them rather than the actual doctor who would be in the island. So, of course, the question is, if Amazon leaves, what remains behind for these islanders? And probably nothing. So, what do we do now? Do we start breaking things at work? I quote here Gavin Mueller's book on the Luddite movement and their significance, the historical significance. And it's very important to understand that these people did have a point, and I agree with them. And of course, we can sabotage these new technologies as much as possible. We should question them, block them, stall them, obfuscate, all of this for sure. But we also, at the same time, I think we need to have a positive horizon of looking at technology as part of the future of humanity. And I think this is what we need to do right now. That critique is one thing, but we don't want to kind of like get rid of all technology, all of this technology, because to a significant extent, this is also something that we have contributed to even if by supplying our data. So, theoretically, I rely a lot on the work of Andrew Finberg. I think that his work, his rereading of Marcuse, is very important and very inspiring for me. Talking about technological attributes as being the result of specific historical and material circumstances. So this kind of datification and this particular kind of artificial intelligence that we see today is a configuration that is very specific to the historical circumstances. It doesn't mean that it's always going to be, that technology always going to have this kind of development. So technology is a site of struggle. And the politics of liberation can and should reappropriate and resocialize technology for its own purposes. And here are the three intersections that I see here in terms of the economy, the life world, and the political sphere. And I know I'm going on, so I kind of like try to summarize here what I see as potential kind of areas of interest for a politics of liberation in these three areas. Okay, some of you may have heard of Gosplan and the Soviet kind of period of planning. And a lot of its economic success depended on how successful this planning was. But this planning was based entirely on people giving like literal feedback and trying to develop a plan by hand or through kind of like basic calculations. So there was this well-known socialist calculation debate with Hayek and others who argued that socialist planning was not possible because the pricing system was very volatile and couldn't work. And then this quote by Trotsky, I think it's very, very interesting. So he says, if a universal mind existed that could register simultaneously all the processes of nature and society, that could measure the dynamics of their motion, that could forecast the results of their interreactions, such a mind, of course, could a priori draw up a faultless and exhaustive economic plan. Could it be that we have this now already? Also interesting here is to note that automation and labor theory of value, people have highlighted the kind of inherent contradiction here that capitalism cannot introduce full automation because if it does so, it forgoes profit, because profit can only be extracted by living labor. So this might be something for a politics of liberation to kind of like work for its favor. So through automation, labor is theoretically at least freed from its association to surplus value. So, of course, under late capitalism, this creates surplus populations that are managed, but from a point of view of a socialist politics, it might open the door for emancipation. This is associated, just so to contextualize it, with the work of Aaron Bastani and perhaps to an extent Paul Mason in terms of fully automated communism. Of course, a lot of this is fantasy. We are nowhere near this level at all. But it's important to note at least that, that in classic Marxist terms, we have this opportunity here. So what is emancipation? Where is emancipation in terms of the life world? So if data can allow for efficient planning and a dissociation of labor from surplus value, how do we understand emancipation? So in Marxism, this is viewed in holistic terms, primarily as emancipation from the alienation imposed by the socio-political and economic system. But since this original conception, of course, other forms were added through people's struggles, especially in terms of gender, race, and heteronormativity. So ideas of emancipation and self-actualization were very important, especially in the context of 1968 and forward. So when we talk about emancipation, we have to take these forms into account. So I have a long quote by Marx here. I'm not going to go through all of it, but just to say that, that emancipation is not individual. It has to be at a species level. That is what I get from this quote, and that is why I think it's important here to understand that data could be used for emancipation, but at this level of species being. And this is how the types of openings that I identify here. In the first instance, emancipation is associated with workers enjoying the fruits of their labor because they own the means of production. That's Marx, right? So if you own the means of production, you can own the data. But it's not individual ownership of your data as some people would have it, or individual profit-making from your data, selling your own data to corporations, but it's collective public ownership of data. The key issue here is to understand that data work only as ensembles, and the more accurate the data, the better the systems relying upon them. I'll make this concrete by using this example. I really dislike Ancestry and 23andMe, right? Again, they're not good guys. They're extractive corporations. However, it's very important to note that they only work if everyone submits their data. So the statistical inferences on genealogy and genetics are only accurate if all of us contribute to them. So to me, this is an important opening, and the usefulness of the data for everyone, for humanity, depends on all of us contributing to this. Now, of course, we don't want to contribute to ancestry because of various reasons and good reasons, but on the other hand, there is an opening here that we can understand that data could be made to work for the human species all together as a collective. So that's how I view it, the opening here. So the value of data for people is not in being compensated from generating them, but in realizing the real value for humanity as a species being. So this is the starting point, focusing on data's ability to produce knowledge about ourselves that is only realizable if we all contribute equally. So a socialist project does not need to be afraid of data. Finally, in terms of technology in the political sphere, and hear me, I'm not a blockchain type of person, but hear me out here. Political governance, I think, could be made more accountable through blockchain systems because they cannot be altered. So a big problem in the kind of like the socialist historical past of the Soviet Union has been corruption, right? And of course, a big problem in capitalism is corruption. But blockchain systems provide a way to kind of like hold people accountable in terms of public spending and also in terms of natural resources. They offer the possibility for decentralized governance systems, for example, the so-called DAOs, where they have rules that are described in blockchain and cannot be altered unless all the members agree to alter them. And also quadratic voting is an important contribution to democracy. I don't know if you know what quadratic voting is. At the moment, it's used in a very kind of like rational choice type of way, where you buy votes. So anyway, the principle of quadratic voting is that there are certain matters in democracy that certain people have more stakes in, or they want to have more involvement in because they affect their life. These matters affect their lives more directly. Quadratic voting gives you the opportunity for your vote to count more. So you're given tokens that are inscribed in a blockchain. So if you have more stakes in a, now it's used for like participatory budgeting, this type of thing. But imagine using it, for example, to give women more say in questions of reproductive health, for example. So that is how I imagine it could be used for more democratic decision-making. So I'm coming now towards the end of my presentation. So I've omitted a lot of things from this presentation, but one thing that I want to make clear now is that a fundamental and basic condition for socializing tech is that we allow tech to be produced outside of the R&D, of research and development parts of big corporations. At the moment, and this is extremely scary for me, the capacity for new technology all belongs to corporations. The capacity of Google, for example, for quantum computing is bigger than any university. And this is very, very, very bad. What can I say? It's like really, really problematic. The fact that universities are not resourced appropriately to develop their own kind of like autonomous, independent knowledge production around technology is very, very important. And you see, the whole discussion around universities has to be discussion around technology as well, because they're happy for universities to produce tech workers, but they're not happy for universities to produce real knowledge around technology, and in particular critical knowledge around technology. So I think this is a discussion that needs to be had locally, national level, in terms of how we fund universities and how we fund research, at the European level for sure, because we're made, universities are made to collaborate with corporations and with the tech sector. Also, in parallel, I think an important condition is the professionalization of tech workers. This is separate, but similar to unionizing workers. Of course, there are movements towards unionizing them, but there are no movements towards professionalizing them. So imagine having a tech council in the same way as a medical council or a legal council to control not control, but afford more autonomy to tech workers. So they can say, I can't do this because the tech council is going to throw me out. Or we need to have, anyway, I think it's an important kind of development to protect protect this knowledge from corporate control. And then thirdly, and I take this from the work of McQuinlan, who proposes people and worker councils to determine how and which kind of tech should be deployed. Ultimately, whatever gets produced doesn't have to be deployed unless people want to deploy it. So these are some conditions, not exhaustive, but some indicative conditions for resocializing technologies. So the current situation is for sure bleak, and it's going to worsen. And this is the West versus China tech Cold War that we don't know how it's going to pan out. But I think that new technological imaginaries are worth pursuing. I think that we cannot just lash out and criticize technology without having an alternative idea of how to use technology for emancipation and liberation. I think it's very, very important because we need specific action to wrest control of technology production, development, and deployment. So thank you very much for your patience.